Hi, and welcome to the Pass Priority Podcast, a podcast where we talk about competitive Commander from a different perspective. I'm joined today by my co-host Zach.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zach, or also Disco Breaker, on most servers and everywhere else on the internet.
Yeah, and today we're going to do an Animar cEDH deck tech.
All right, so why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more in your history with the deck, because I know you have quite the history with this deck, Evan.
Yeah, so I'm Evan, also known as zclan7 on Discord. I play and maintain the most up-to-date cEDH Animar deck with my good friend Jack, JM Craig on Discord. Um, well, I first started playing Magic it's been like a year and 8 months now, probably. So I started playing last year at some point. But when I started playing, it was definitely a different deck. I picked up Animar because my friend's dad actually had an Animar deck, and I was like, I just dumped my whole hand out on one turn, and it was awesome. So I kind of started there and slowly moved up in power level.
Yeah, I
Uh,
definitely know that similar feeling. When I was first learning Magic back in I think like 2013, 2014, one of the first commanders I picked up was Animar, and I definitely like tried to push the power levels as much as I could without having like a great foundation of like what makes something competitive, what makes something powerful. And I remember very similar feelings of just like, you mean I can play this giant nullstone gargoyle for 2 mana? That's awesome.
oh, it's definitely a different feeling, and you're talking about playing Animar back in a day without the printing of Ancestral Statue, which we'll get to here in a little bit.
Oh yeah.
But we're talking about like a completely different deck, probably like 60 cards different than what it is today.
Oh, definitely.
Um, yeah, and just to kind of go off from that, I kind of wanted to start about just literally talking about what the card is and what it does. So I'm just going to read everything about the card and we'll talk about how it works. So Animar is a 3 CMC 1/1 creature, teamer to cast, protection from white and black. Whenever you cast a creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Animar. Creature spells you cast cost one colorless less for each +1/+1 counter on him. So right, you cast a Arbor Elf, and he gets a +1/+1 counter if he's out, right? So you can take your big bombs and cost reduce them. So that's how it works as
I think
far
an
as
important note here is that it doesn't count the power and toughness of Animar. It is specifically the number of counters on it.
yes, this
So I think a
is
lot of
correct.
people
A,
get
a
confused
common,
by that.
yeah, a common misconception worth bringing up.
So now that we know what Animar is, what it does, can you tell me a little bit more about the remaining 99 cards in the deck and sort of how it all comes together? Is this like
Right.
an aggressive combo deck? Is it more mid-rangey? Can it kind of like flex back and forth between the two? Let's start there.
So it's kind of flex. It's in a really interesting spot because Teamer as a color combination doesn't get really easy access to breach lines because they're hard to tutor up, and it doesn't get really easy access to card draw. Which kind of need to happen. So and it doesn't get it in the command zone with Animar, so you have to kind of fit it into your 99, which makes slots a little weird and tight. But it definitely is a more grindy mid-range deck. But it has very narrow win lines in terms of mana costs.
Cool.
So I'll just move
So
right into win lines. I think it's a good place to start.
Uh, actually, let's start with like, you said it's more on the mid-range spectrum. About like, what would you say the average turn that it can win is? Just to give us an idea. If we say like a
Ooh.
Grixis shell can usually win on turns like 2 or 3 if unopposed. Where does Animar sort of fall?
Looking around, it's probably 4 to 5. 3 if it can really get that dockside in early. But it tries to. You're going to want to try to push the game a little longer, and the longer you can push the game, the higher your chances of winning because you're just able to accumulate those resources and that value and really just kind of build up a board state, put yourself in a winning
Cool. I think
position.
we'll see that really reflected in some of the card choices that we'll talk about in a bit.
100%.
Well, so I'll let you get back to it. What were the one card win lines? I think is where you wanted to go
Yeah,
next.
so I'll just start with the win lines and we'll talk about the easiest way to get there. So what makes Animar cEDH viable for being such an old commander, um, I think it came out in like 2011 was the first commander set. I don't remember
Yes, it
exactly.
was. I think it's Commander 2011 because 2013
Yeah.
was the second Commander printings.
Yeah, like I said, have no clue because I was not around. But yeah, so since it's so old, it needs something really niche and unique and powerful to stay relevant at all in the current meta. So what it does is it combos with it's a one card combo with Ancestral Statue, which is a 4 CMC 3/4 creature that says when it upon ETB you may pick up not may you have to pick up a non-land permanent you control and put it back in your hand. So if Animar has 4 counters or more, you can cast it, ETB on the stack, rebounce the statue to your hand, and so on and so forth. Go for infinite counters on Animar, and then use that cost reduction to cost reduce a Walking Ballista. Put the Walking Ballista on the stack for a million counters, and then try to shoot the pod to death
All
once it
right.
lands. So
So
getting
I
there,
believe Ancestral Statue came out in the cons block, which is probably I think 2014, if I remember. And I can't remember
was that
where eighth.
2016? I think
Is it 2016? I thought it was earlier than that.
2015 is what the card says. So
2015. Okay.
I'd hope that's 2015.
And I think that's also right around when Walking Ballista came out. So there's definitely the deck did exist in some capacity before then. We're not super familiar with it from before then. Like I know when I played with like Kiki Jiki and Palancron and all these like wacky different lines.
Oh yeah, it's
Completely different deck. So the one that we're going to focus on here is definitely like this Ancestral Statue. Really is the iconic card of the deck and what separates it out from pretty much any other cEDH deck. I can't think of any other reason why you would be running Ancestral Statue.
it's not a fantastic card. I will tell you that
It's
it's
so
not a
bad.
great card. It's I
it's
think my foil was like literally $1.
Yeah, it was unplayable even in limited. So to be an all-star in this deck, it's gotta be pretty niche.
Yeah, I would say this deck would not exist as it is now in any cEDH meta without the printing of Ancestral Statue and Walking Ballista. So those are very important. So it's cool that you can actually get to that combo really easily. So we're just going to go through the main win lines, the ways to get there. So
Mhm.
the first line is the Recruiter line or the Neoform line. So you want Animar at least 2 counters, and then you can cast your Imperial Recruiter, which we'll talk about why that's so good in a little bit. But you cast your Imperial Recruiter, go fetch up a Phyrexian Metamorph, cast Phyrexian Metamorph for free now because Animar has 3 counters on him or more or whatever. Copy Imperial Recruiter, go fetch up your Spellseeker, cast your Spellseeker. Spellseeker goes and gets a Neoform. You cast Neoform, sacrificing the Spellseeker to go get your uh, Ancestral Statue. Ancestral Statue will be put right onto the battlefield, and then with the trigger on the stack, you'll resolve that trigger and put the statue back in your hand. And now proceed to cast Ancestral Statue as many times as you need to get Animar arbitrarily big. And then with the last resolution of the statue ETB, you'll pick up the Phyrexian Metamorph, recast the Phyrexian Metamorph paying 2 life, and copy Imperial Recruiter to go fetch up the Walking Ballista, and then cast the Walking Ballista with a million counters per se.
All
Then
right.
you'll shoot the
So
pod.
that's red, blue, blue, green are the only color
Correct.
requirements on that one.
As
All
long as
right.
Animar is at 2 counters, it's only 4 mana. It's a lot of steps. It's a lot of
Mhm.
tutoring. Normally my pods fold before I finish the tutor line, but it's a lot of tutoring. But it is only 4 mana, so it's really compact, and you got there using only your Imperial Recruiter. And what's really cool about this line is you don't need to do it necessarily all in one turn. So if I just have to Animar is at no counters, I have to pay 3 mana to cast my Recruiter, right? And then go get my Metamorph, or you can skip the Metamorph step if you want to, or you don't have access to it. Um, but you can do that in one turn, and then next turn cast your Spellseeker, and then go get your Neoform, and then if you want next turn, then use your Neoform. So it's like it's really layered in that sense, is that you can enter the combo at any phase during the combo to kind of activate it.
Yeah, it's sort of like a any different stop along the way you can enter.
Yeah, which is what makes that so powerful.
Nice.
Um, The second way that the current build of Animar wins is actually without Animar. You don't need Animar in play to do it. It's just a Dockside Baron Master Wizard loop. So for those of you who don't know, it's Dockside has to create at least 6 treasures, and then you have Baron out. You sacrifice 2 treasures to make mana, sacrifice a third treasure to Baron's ability, and then you can bounce your Dockside back to your hand and then recast your Dockside using 2 treasures, netting 1 mana each time. So in theory, all Animar is making infinite mana for your Ballista. This also just makes infinite mana, but it's in treasures instead of Animar counters,
Okay,
which is
that
kind
makes a
of
lot
the
of
idea
sense.
here. And it
Mhm.
also lets you use ETB effects. I'll just talk about Baron real quick because it is such an important piece to the deck. One colorless blue blue for a 1/1 Legend. Baron Master Wizard counts as a wizard. Good to know. And then you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice a permanent, return target creature to its owner's hand. So it's kind of a weird utility piece in that you can use it to combo, use it to bounce your own ETB effects, and also interact with your opponents. Um, but yeah, he's really important to the deck as a whole.
Okay. Um, can you go into that a little bit more? So, like outside of this, obviously, like this Dockside infinite mana combo, where else do you usually see him coming up, or for like value?
Yeah, totally. So things like if you're not winning, obviously your dockside isn't on the
Mhm.
battlefield and you're not able to combo, you can use it to bounce things like your Gilded Drake or your Imperial Recruiter or your Spell Seeker. Any of these really important ETBs you can just bounce right back to your hand and reuse if you need to. Um, the mana value is a little steep, but that's what you get for such good utility, as long as also being a win con. But then like I'll bounce your Crom if it's a tempo play, or just bounce the thing that you're using to win the game right now.
But
Um,
yeah, I think a lot of
on my
people
turn.
overlook that fact that you can bounce not just your own permanents, but you can like proactively bounce your opponent's pieces and either try and like disrupt their combo, break apart their tempo plays, or like even just remove something like a torpor orb effect that might be preventing you from going off.
Yeah, I a lot of my plays into Staxy pods, I will say they'll drop like an Archon of Emery on turn 1 or 2. I'll grind value for a few turns, and then I'll drop this Baron, and then use the Baron to bounce the Archon, and now I'm kind of ready to go off now instead of just removing Archon per se, but not allowing them to redeploy it if I don't win, which is also
Definitely.
really important.
So those are those the only two like sort of one card or the two main win cons there, the Baron loop and the ancestral statue lines.
Yes, but I want to talk about how important it is that Imperial Recruiter gives you that one card win con, because
Mhm.
since you just need the Recruiter to be able to combo using this line, you can kind of use every single tutor in your deck that tutors a creature as part of the one card win line. You just start the line with a tutor instead of the bear or instead of the Recruiter. So I could cast a Eldritch Evolution, go get Recruiter, and then start the line from there. So it's kind of anything that can just get you to that starting point, really kind of just spirals you into this line.
Yeah. So as far as like other options to tutor for here, you got like Fauna Shaman, Worldly Tutor, Eldritch Evolution, Sylvan Tutor. Weird Harvest is one that I don't see very frequently. You want to talk a bit more about that one?
Yeah, so Weird Harvest is a X green green sorcery that says each player may search his or her library for up to X creature cards. Reveal those cards and put them into his or her hand. Then each player who searched this way shuffles their library. So what this means is that if I cast this on X equals 1, the entire pod each searches their deck for one creature, reveals them all at the same time, and then shuffles their library. So this lets all of your opponents just search for their Docksides and their Thrasis Oracles and things like that. But
I
it's
imagine they're usually not getting another turn.
yeah, you don't want to give them the next turn because you are 100% losing after this card resolves and you are not able to win. So what Weird Harvest and things like Shared Summons do for us here is it allows you to search for more than one creature on one tutor for less than 5 mana, which is huge because if you can just tutor for 2 creatures, you just tutor for your Ancestral Statue and Walking Ballista, or Ancestral Statue and Beast Whisperer. Those 2 creatures that you need to close the game out without having to spend a lot of mana up front to get 2 creatures. So it's these tutors that give you a really good rate for what they are. Things like Survival of the Fittest is another one of them. Fauna Shaman, if you can use it at an end step and on your turn.
And
Yeah,
I imagine
anything that
these
can
double
just give you.
tutor lines, even if you have one of the pieces, the other piece that you're usually going to get when you have access to tutors is probably Dockside.
Oh, it's usually your first tutor is usually used on Dockside. It's such an important piece to the deck that I fear for how the deck will run without a Dockside if that day ever does come. But I would say that if I don't cast a Dockside in any given game, I probably lost that game just because of how the deck runs off of it. Right, you go get your Dockside, you have your Phantasmal Image and your Metamorph to kind of copy the Dockside. You have the Baron and all these other bounce effects to kind of give you more Docksides. So on average, I probably cast like 4 Docksides in a game or something ridiculous.
Yeah, I played against you, I think the other week when I was on Magda, which is like the dedicated treasure deck. I am just trying to make treasures, and I think I was the only one in that pod that did not cast a Dockside, and you would cast like 2 or 3 of them, and I was not having a good time that game.
Yeah, I think I'm so not including infinite treasures right off Baron Dockside
Mhm.
loops. I think I've probably made the most manual treasures out of anyone I've ever met, just in that regard. But yeah, it really just gives you, since Animar is basically a battery that you have to spend 3 mana for and then build up counters to be able to then combo. It's a little bit more setup, which just means you just need the dockside or a really powerful ritual to throw you into that game-winning position. Because you can have a really set up board, but no Animar, so you're kind of in this weird place of
I do
not being
like
able
that
to win
line
the
of
game.
thinking though, with Animar kind of acting like a battery that you have to invest into in order to get that super payout.
Oh yeah, I'll talk about it later, but it's this playstyle of the deck isn't, you don't want to just rush your Animar out there as fast as possible and then try to build counters as fast as possible, and then go for your win on turn 3 when you're not really protected or ready. Because if you're just trying to turbo out like that, you're not going to be able to actually see your turn 3 because someone else is going to outpace you. Like the turn 2 Adnaz you didn't have a counterspell for example. You're not going to be able to outrace those turbo decks, so you have to kind of approach it from a different angle.
Yeah, the younger me that was first starting to play Magic definitely just wanted to play his turn 2 Animar and make all of the
Yeah.
counters possible as fast as possible. But I can
Yeah, we'll
definitely
definitely
see
talk
how
about
that
that.
is not going to behoove you in today's format.
Oh, 100%. Uh, so yeah, we can kind of talk about how the deck kind of is looking to start a game in that regard.
Sure.
Then, since we're not trying to turbo into the win right away, how you want to set up your board. So when you're mulliganing an Animar, it's what the deck has kind of become is just Temur good stuff. So you're just trying to get a lot of mana, set up some kind of large card draw option or something that gives you card advantage. So you can refill your hand and then kind of just assemble this value and hold open counter magic until you're in a winning position. So we'll just talk about some of those cards you're kind of looking for to just give you a lot of that value so you can put yourself into the win. Things like Consecrated Sphinx is the largest one in the deck. It's right 6 mana for this thing that just gives you undeniably the best card advantage in the game. Well, in Teamer, right? No ad
Yeah,
nauseums or things
we
like
don't
that.
get ad nos, we don't get necropotence or anything like that.
Yeah, nothing like that.
But that is
But
interesting
it's
to see. It's not, or Consecrated Sphinx isn't completely foreign to the format. There have definitely been other decks that have run it before. I know, notably,
McKinnon.
Kinnon's run it, Razakets has run it as just an alternative reanimation target. But
Mm.
being able to cast it for blue definitely pushes this card way over the top. I think most blue decks would run it if it only cost 2 mana.
Oh, 100%. What's special about Animar is that when I'm approaching my deck and deck building and thinking about cuts, it's is this card good on its own without Animar? And if the answer is yes, then it gets a lot more thought put into it because at that point, if it's good without Animar, imagine how good it is with Animar in play and some counters, right? Even a 4 mana Consecrated Sphinx is a lot different than a 6 mana Consecrated Sphinx.
Yeah, I
And
guess it's fair to cut Nullstone Gargoyle in that case.
yeah, No Stone Gargoyle definitely doesn't make the cut in 2022, unfortunately. But a special thing about Sphinx is I actually call my personal deck list Animar Evolution because I'm trying to turn my creatures on the battlefield into bigger creatures or better creatures or more utility. So what you can do is you can kind of just play like a 4 mana creature or pod out a 5 mana creature, but then just pod into this Consecrated Sphinx, which is just going to push your space in the game a lot ahead of your opponents.
Makes a lot of sense.
So Consecrated Sphinx is just one
Um,
of the ones to talk about, but there's also other card draw options that I wanted to mention, like Frostfang, or
Wandering
obviously you
Archaic
have
is
your
another one I
Priestess.
see.
Wandering Archaic. So
Yeah,
Wandering Archaic doesn't. It's a really interesting one. I had to fight for this one to kind of get into get on the deck before I became like a major part in its creation. So what Wandering Cake does is it's a really hard card to evaluate when you're playing it, right? Because you drop this 5 mana or less with Animar out, 5 mana creature that says you get to double up on your opponent's spells unless they pay more mana. And it's like, well, I cast this Wandering Cake and it did absolutely nothing for me. So like it's not really good for the deck. But what you don't see is your opponent holding up their demonic tutor and their ad nauseum and their counter magic against you and all these other things because they don't have the 2 mana to pay into you on
Yeah,
top of
Wandering
their.
Archaic definitely introduces this weird sub game when it enters play, where it kind of becomes the focal point of this game, and everyone has to figure out: can I afford to give my opponent this copy of the spell, or do I have to pretend that this demonic tutor is now what is it, diabolic tutor? That's two
Hmm.
black black, like
Yeah.
that kind of debate. I've done other things like giving my opponents access to tutors so that they can also find answers to try and stop win cons. So it's definitely a very interesting card that rewards creative thinking and a higher level of play.
I'm up to 5 ad nauseums cast in Animar using 1 year archaic. And every single time it does not work out for the ad naus player because they're like, he's not going to find anything. Flip, mana dork, flip, mana rock, flip, force of will, flip, other blue card to pitch the forest. And it's just like this undeniable value that you don't see while you're playing 1 year archaic all the time. It actually took someone else playing 1 year archaic against me to be like, this is too much. This needs to be in this deck because of how powerful it really is. And like you said, it's good when it's alone, but it's also great when Animar is cost reducing it to even 0, 1, 2, 3, whatever it is, because then it also acts as a protection piece against counter magic. I use that all the time. It's like if I have this extra tutor but not a lot of mana, I'll just put out this 1 year archaic and see what happens.
It's like, what if you had a defense grid, but it only stopped your opponents?
Right. Exactly. Let's
So
talk
there's some
about.
other interesting ones that I don't see in many decks. I think the ones I wanted to pick out were
Yeah, pick
Grazilax,
pick one out.
Aethelid Scholar, and
Grazilax.
Mezio Mugger. So which
Ooh,
one do you want to start with?
these are some
These are
spicy
some
ones. Let's start with
these are some
Grazilax, I
hot
say.
ones.
It's
All
the
right.
Grazilax is the more based pick here. So we'll start with Grazilax. It's essentially got the same text as Timna for a colorless and blue to cast instead of Timna's casting cost. For a
Mhm.
3/2 creature that says whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you can return it to your hand, and then whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. Sounds a lot like Timna, but in blue. So if I swing a creature at 2 opponents and they both don't block, I get to draw 2 cards. Or if I swing a creature at you and you do block, I can just put that creature back in my hand without combat damage happening.
And something
So,
like an Imperial Cruider or a Dockside or
mhm,
something like you're more than happy to pick those things up.
no one has ever blocked my Dockside with the Grazilax out. Unfortunately, I'm waiting for it to happen. But you can set up these weird value engines where you have your ETB creatures that gave you some other value, but then also they're free card draw every turn because they're not going to give you another Imperial Recruiter, which we'll talk about Imperial Recruiter more later, but it basically just gives you every creature in your deck essentially besides the statue. So they don't want to give you all these extra value pieces for free when it's like the top card is probably better than what they're going to tutor for, right? So
Yeah, I think it's
Grazilax is
important to
definitely
note on
interesting.
this one that it's during blocks. So if your opponent blocks before damage even happens, so you can swing your 1/1
Hmm.
into a giant 7/7, you're going to pick it back up. It doesn't matter the size or the power or toughness.
Yeah, so it's kind of like pseudo death touch per se. Like they're not going
Mhm.
to lose their creature, but also I'm going to put that creature back in my hand. So they have to kind of decide which is better for them, and usually it's me drawing a card is better for them than me tutoring for a card.
Yeah, it's a
So,
win-win situation for you, it sounds like.
oh, all the time.
Cool.
Then we'll talk about Mezio Mugger, which I think I'm gonna have to describe this card because it is not common. So it came out in New Capenna. It is a 4 colorless and a red casting cost 3/3 creature. That's a Vishino Rogue creature type. Whenever Mezio Mugger attacks, you exile the top card of each player's library. You may play those cards this turn, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those cards. Or you can pay its blitzing cost, which is 2 colorless and a red, which gives it haste for the turn, but then it
Yep.
also dies on the end step. But if you blitzed it
Um,
that turn, then you also get to draw a card when it dies.
correct.
So let's just talk about the logistics of what this, or the sheer number of what this card does. So if I blitz it out, we'll just say Animar's at 2 counters. I pay 1 mana, I
Mhm.
blitz it, go to combat. I exile the top card of each player's library. So I get 1 card off my library, 1 card out of each of my opponent's libraries, and I can spend mana as though we're mana of any color. play those cards. So I can hit your land drop off the top of your deck, spend 3 colorless mana for this Rhystic Study off the top of someone else's deck, or cast your Ad Nauseam using only blue mana type thing. There's all these things you can do. So what I just did is I spent 1 mana to make 4 cards, which
Oh yeah,
is
because
really
the
large.
blitz is technically an alternative casting cost, which
Hmm.
Animar still does reduce the casting cost.
Yes, any casting cost doesn't really matter what it is. Most of the time, Animar just reduce it. So Animar reducing this to 1 mana is really powerful. And what's so great about this card is I would probably spend 3 mana to just blitz this out if I have nothing else going on. 3 mana, get 4 cards, and then when it dies, you draw another card. So you just got 5 cards for 3 mana or less. It's
It's a nice little
pretty.
burst of value.
It's a nice burst of value, especially in Teamer where you can't really get all that value and you're kind of grasping for those card draw effects. So I was really excited when this card came out and it replaced things like Mull Drifter in the deck, which were kind of outdated.
Man, I'm gonna miss Drifter though. The card is so sweet.
There's yeah, we'll get to recent changes. There's a lot of things I want to say.
Cool. So I think other unique creatures that I see in the deck here, we have Glen Alendra.
So Glen Alondra is do you want to read Glen?
Sure. Glen Alendra Archmage, 3 and a blue for a 2/2 creature fairy wizard with flying, and then it has the ability blue, sacrifice Glen Alendra Archmage, counter target non-creature spell, and it also has persist.
So 2 counter spells on a stick is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
So it's really fantastic in the way that it's a tutorable counterspell, right? So 4 mana and 5 mana is so 5 mana you get your first counterspell,
Mhm.
which is not fantastic at all. But what you get on the upside of Glen is you can essentially pay 1 blue or like 1 blue and a colorless or something like that to cast Glen Alondra, and now you have that onboard piece of interaction that is kind of uncounterable, right? Because it's on a creature, so it's not really it's not a spell in the stack; it's an ability. It's an ability to counter something, so it lets you just kind of get away with a lot more stuff because people don't want to play their ad nauseum into it because they can't back it up with their flusterstorm or something like
Yeah,
that.
outside of something like a deflecting swat that can redirect the ability, there's not a lot that can interact with this unless you're some idiot running Stifle. I
Oh
don't know
yeah,
who would do
stifles are good.
that.
Yeah, don't do that. Well, maybe we might be getting to that point, but that's not for me to decide.
But yeah, this is an interesting effect. It sort of has this again, like the Wandering Archaic, or when I think back to Legacy, something like Standstill, where you kind of are in like a staring match with your opponent, but you aren't playing on even terms here. Like you're sitting with this onboard counter that they have to play around, they have to respect. And the only thing that it really costs you after you get it into play, which assumingly you're doing it at a cheaper rate than what the card was designed, thanks to Animar and his ability, um, you just have to hold up a blue mana, and
Yeah,
they are
it's super
forced to sit
reasonable.
there and play around this or to remove it. And if they're using something like a lightning bolt to get rid of this, it's going to come back. So you're forced to like swords it or something else to just remove it entirely.
Yeah, what I think keeps Glen viable over another counterspell isn't just the fact that you can tutor it on like your double tutors or things like that, or as an extra protection piece. It's that they have to feed it. They absolutely have to feed this. Whether it's like one spell is going to go down to it no matter what, right? So even if you cast Lightning Bolt, that just ate a Lightning Bolt and not your Animar, your combo piece. Or if it's their turn, they don't really want to use their good spell because someone else, they might not have 2 good spells to use, so they have to wait for someone else to feed it. And I actually saw this this Reddit post the other day because everything's on Reddit of this guy that's just like, what am I supposed to do against the Glenalandra? I played against this card and it's just I had to sit there with all my win con in my hand, but I couldn't do anything because I couldn't double activate it. And all the comments were just like, feed it, just literally feed it. You have to just feed it, and that's what I think makes Glen so powerful is that you there's no getting around it. You kind of have to sit there and deal with it until it's gone.
Yeah,
Um,
like there, you can't just sit there and not cast your spells for that long.
yeah, that's a whole turn rotation is just like ridiculous, but that's normally what it is. If I just have to cast Glen and pass, no one's able to double feed it because if they know if they feed it and then have to pass the turn, they just opened it up to someone else.
Hmm.
And the persist trigger on Glen is also really interesting because it allows you to actually use Glen as a sackable body to your tutors. So like Birthing Pod, I can Birthing Pod away my Glen Alondra to go get my Frostfang, which is card advantage, and then he'll come back with still that counter on her with persist. So I just, if I'm able to cost reduce this in any way, it just becomes bizarre. But I just basically churned my 4 mana body plus whatever the cost of my tutor is into a 5 mana card draw engine and another uncounterable counterspell.
Oh, that's gross.
Oh, it's definitely ridiculous.
Ugh. So,
Oh,
I
speaking
think
of
another
doing that,
card we
actually,
have here is
yeah.
Painter's Servant.
So Painter Servant is one I'm actually. I'll just lead off with I'm actually experimenting without Painter Servants in this deck for my own personal reasons, but we'll see how that goes. Um, so Animar has protection from white and black, and protection is just you cannot interact with it. You targeting
Yeah,
it using these
the old
colors in any
acronym
way.
is Det, Damage, Enchant, Block, or Target. So most things deal with those one of those kinds of interactions. That's like how you interact with things. You can apply damage to it, you can enchant it, you can block it, you can target it. Animar says no to white and black, which are two of the primary colors that deal with creatures. The
Yeah,
only remaining one is something like lightning bolts. I'm sure Animar has eaten plenty of lightning bolts.
it's normally REBs. It's come close to a couple Hydro Blasts recently. But yeah, it's mostly REBs and Lightning Bolts these days. But that's just because that's all I see. I don't ever see the
Mhm.
Path or the other black removal spell that can remove Animar because it just can't. If that makes sense.
Uh, so are you using Painter Servant mainly to shut off those effects and further protect your Animar?
Yeah, so what Painter Servant does is it just makes everything, literally
Mhm.
everything, this black, basically. And since everything's black, nothing can interact with your Animar, nothing can block your Animar, all these different things. So it gives you really easy ways to swing in with Animar for lethal damage, even if though they might have a blocker. Or it allows you to just it forces them to have to use another piece of removal on a creature to then get to your Animar, which is two removal, and it gets difficult to kind of lap over those layers. But Painter Servant is a really powerful effect when paired with Animar. Um,
Not to
the only thing
mention
I
just the level of disruption that it has in the format with things like it shuts off the alternate costs of Force of Will and Force of Negation. Your Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast are all of a sudden dead.
Oh, 100%. I mean, with Painter Servant on the stack, there's so many times that the pod's like, all right, well, this is kind of our last chance to do anything about this. And then that's normally when I eat the REB, and it's like, well, I mean, I was kind of asking for it at that point. But yeah, if that doesn't happen, it's a really powerful effect that not a lot of people see coming because I don't think
Yeah.
I've seen Painter Servant anywhere in cEDH besides this exact spot.
I know many people were afraid when it became unbanned, which I think was like around 2017, 2018, somewhere in there. Like it's not
I
it
know it was
hasn't been in
banned
the
at some
format
point.
for that long. And I think like the old boogeyman was like, what if I pair this with Iona? And I think they rightfully banned. I think Iona's banned.
I think Ion was
Which
banned.
is
That's
just
one
like
that
what a
counters
miserable card.
every color.
It's
Yeah,
yeah, you can't cast cards of the chosen color.
yeah,
So I think they
100%.
definitely got that one right. But it's interesting to see what this card can do. It's a lot of interesting little use cases that kind of combine together to make it worth the inclusion in such a tight list.
Yeah, I'll just mention some of the small things you can do within this deck. Besides just protect your commander,
Mhm,
you name black with it. Your Veil of Summer gets infinitely better because now nothing your opponent's cast can target your board
mhm.
because your entire board has hexproof from black. Or you use your Allosaurus Shepherd, which says your green spells can't be countered, and then you just name green, and what are they gonna do? Right? They're forced to interact with you on the battlefield instead of on the stack, which is another little interesting combination.
Man, I would have never came up with those lines myself, but hearing them, they just seem so obvious now.
Oh,
That's
I've been
awesome.
in some tight spots. That's the whole reason they've come up.
Cool. So I think oh wait, we had spirit guide interaction with utility tutors and another creature body. Want you to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so Spirit Guide, Simian Spirit Guide, and
Hmm.
Elvish Spirit Guide, obviously really powerful and prominent in cEDH because it's a free mana from your hand. It's a one color Lotus Petal type deal. But what they do in Animar isn't just the mana ability, they also present themselves as creatures. So the turbo deck, when it's like on top deck mode and it top decks the Spirit Guide, and they're like, okay. When Animar top decks the Spirit Guide with its Survival of the Fittest out, it just discards the Spirit Guide because it's a creature and goes and gets something else. So it's really interesting that you can use any creature in your deck to as a tutor essentially, because you can neoform your spirit guides after you cast them, or you pod them away type thing. So they just become really good in Animar, and I know there's some pushback on spirit guides when they were introduced into the deck, and I kind of don't see that because of all the. So it's free mana, and it's also this extra additive that no other deck is really able to utilize, right? The black decks don't really want to pay 3 mana and then Diabolic Intent the Spirit Guide all the time, right? But Animar doesn't mind paying 1 mana for the Spirit Guide, then potting it away into a statue.
Yeah, you're just looking for that like critical mass of bodies to put into play than to convert into some other value piece or some resource. Like
Yeah,
just having that piece of cardboard in play is a resource in and of itself that a lot of decks don't get to utilize.
no, 100%. You can just the ability to be able to churn any card in your deck into another card in your deck is what makes Animar really powerful, in my opinion. So if I run 29 creatures, but I have a tutor that can tutor for any creature as long as I discard a creature, that's a ridiculous effect. That's just a free tutor at that point. And the Spirit Guide kind of opens up 2 extra slots for that kind of tutor.
Makes sense. All right. Were there any other cards you wanted to highlight in here, or do we want to get into some of the things that you've cut from the list, interestingly enough?
Yeah, we can go right into that. So,
Cool. So I know the big one I had when we were first starting this conversation,
mhm.
Finale of Devastation. Finale is like one of the prominent green spells in the format. It's a win condition in a lot of decks. It's a utility piece. You can get things from the graveyard, so it acts as recursion. I it seems like a perfect home for this type of effect.
So the way I'll say it here is Finale is probably the best tutor that we're not running. And I've probably said that 20 times since I cut Finale from my initial list. So Finale is what? So what is the win con in Animar? So we're assuming we're going for the statue line. We have to find a way to both get the statue and the ballista in one line. So we kind of have to go through Recruiter or Spellseeker into Weird Harvest. So we're talking about a lot of mana. So if we have to do the recruiter line, we have to spend 5 mana to get the recruiter into play because Animar can't cost reduce the tutor. And then after that 5 mana, then we can start the line instead of starting the line from just an Imperial recruiter, for example. Which is a kind of a bad argument you could say because you have to tutor for the card, and of course you have to use the tutor. But it's such a high CMC tutor that for one creature that it's not really worth it in that respect, because the other competition for a 5 CMC tutor is Shared Summons and Weird Harvest, which get 2 to 3 creatures to your hand instead of just
Yeah,
one
that's the
creature to
big
the
one.
battlefield.
Finale can't get you your walking ballista if that's the piece that you're missing. Those other
Right.
tutors that go into your hand can, or the ones that are going directly into play are cheaper options. And
Oh,
I'm
100%.
assuming that despite making a ton of mana, you're not often casting this for X is 10 or more. I'm sure that with like the amount of dockside mana that you can make that you're probably able to do it. But at this point, like you're probably winning that game if you're casting a 12 cost card.
Oh, 100%. And the thing is Animar can run 13 to 14 tutors so easily, so ridiculously easily between all of the green creature tutors, things like Chord, Finale, or not Finale, sorry, Chord, Weird Harvest,
Yep.
Lana Shaman,
Evolution, Worldly
Evolution.
Tutor, Sylvan Tutor,
Just
Evolution, Neoform.
all of these things that the deck can support that other decks like black decks, Grixis piles don't get access to because they run like 9, 8 tutors because that's all that they have in those colors.
Mhm.
That it's like, why would I run another tutor that's kind of just bad when I don't feel like tutoring is ever the problem, right? You could say like, oh, why you should always run the maximum number of tutors, but I always have a tutor in my hand, so what's the point of this, right?
Makes a lot of sense. You're also going to eventually start hitting a critical mass of like non-creature cards in your deck, and as we stated before about the spirit guides, having just a blank creature card has value in this deck in how you're able to
Oh,
convert that into a different resource. So if you're drawing that non-creature card or you have too many non-creature cards, you're starting to dilute that pool.
so I have this philosophy recently since I started kind of being one of the sole proprietors of revising the deck or making it to what it is, that I'm gonna just keep cutting creatures until I get punished for it. That's just what I'm gonna keep doing because we'll talk about it when we talk about more changes I've made. But the deck started at like 45 creatures when I started playing it last year, and then as I kind of got into cEDH and making changes, it's just gone from like 45 to 40 to 35, and now I'm at 29, and I'm still not being punished for it, as in like my tutors aren't turned on or um, my Animar can't get counters fast enough type thing. So I'm just going to keep going until that doesn't work, but there is definitely a critical mass. I know it exists that
Mhm.
will be hit if you cut more creatures from the deck.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. One of the other interesting exclusions that I found in the deck were the Modern Horizons pitch elementals. So notably, I think Endurance and Fury are probably the two most effective ones that we can play. Probably mostly just Endurance at this point. Um,
Yeah, so
any
I'll
thoughts
talk
on those?
about for Fury, we'll just go over that real quick because that question does come up sometimes
Mhm.
in the Discord. People are like, well, why not just run Fury? It's a tutorable creature removal spell. The issue with Fury is that there's not a lot of actually red spells in the deck, so you have trouble finding the other pitch card to the Fury. I think I'll just count them up real quick. It's like five, six, seven red cards in the deck
Yeah,
that
that
aren't
makes
Animar.
sense. And they're like Dockside Extortionist and Imperial Recruiter, which you don't really
You
want to
don't
be
want to be
pitching.
pitching. Yeah. So that just kind of gets awkward in its own respect. But as far as endurance goes, what endurance does is it stops breach wins, right, and stops the oracle wins.
Mhm.
Those are the two big things that it does. But my argument in that case is, why would you run this one spell that has the niche thing of stopping your opponents and not really helping yourself, because this deck doesn't really need its graveyard or need to like get cards out of the graveyard. Why
Yep.
not just run a counterspell in that slot? Because the counterspell, at least it protects you and then also stops any of those win attempts that you're trying to stop in the first place.
All right. I like that line. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Cool. So you mentioned that there have been a lot of recent changes, and taking a look at this list and what I remember from looking at old primer lists from probably around like
Hmm.
2017, 2018. Yeah, this list is wildly different.
Oh
So why don't
yeah.
you walk us through some of the major changes that you've made? I know you said you cut
So
down from like 45 to 29 creatures. What were those creatures that you cut?
oh god, so to name all of them would probably just be completely ridiculous. But the real recent thing that the deck has kind of gone through is it's just gone from this super huge shift in philosophy, right? The philosophy used to be ramp on turn 1 using a mana dork or something alike. Turn 2 cast Animar, turn 3 set up, turn 4 win. Right? There was a step-by-step philosophy that the old primer lists wanted you to do.
Yep, that's the
And
list I remember.
and right, and that's a powerful thing in and of itself, maybe 3 years ago or more. But
Hmm.
now it's like decks are attempting a win on turn 2, and you're tapped out with your Animar on the battlefield on turn 2, not able to stop them unless you have like the lucky Force of Will or something, right?
Yeah, and I think if you're just mulliganing to Force of Will, you're already losing that game. Like your deck is not designed to be the control deck at that point.
Oh no, definitely not. It doesn't want to be controlling. Well, I'll talk about that in a second, 'cause
Hmm.
that's another philosophy thing that I kind of believe in. But so since we when I was playing, I was like, man, this is really not the right way to be doing this. And that's when I kind of shifted into changing the deck for myself instead of just net decking, because that's all cEDH is. It's net decking and then fixing it after that. Um, the mana base changed to rocks. So before the deck was on what it wasn't on Soul Ring, so it was on Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, Lotus Petal,
Chromox.
and
I don't even.
Chromox. It was
Yeah,
literally four pieces of
that's wild.
artifacts
Like this
ramp.
was one of the only CEDH decks known that did not run Soul Ring.
Oh, 100% was in a weird place. I was against Soul Ring for a very long time. I
It
was a
doesn't
very
cast
new
Animar on
player.
turn two.
Doesn't cast Animar on turn two, so there was no reason for it. But it ran those four artifacts, and then it was an oof deck. So it just ran a collector oof. There was no null rod, but it ran the collector oof. Because it could bounce its own oof using the ancestral statue trigger,
Hmm.
to just bounce it, so it didn't really affect it. But that's not something I want to get into too much. So I shifted it to be rock heavy. So this talismans, I put in Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, the three talismans in Teamer, and kind of shifted the land and mana base with Jack to kind of support this rock package. So we put in an Ancient Tomb, Gemstone Caverns, went off of the kind of really bad rainbow lands, like Ancient Ziggurat, which only casts creatures, and Thran Query, which just had the chance of sacrificing itself randomly in the middle of a game. Um, I recently put in things like Rite of Flame to help support the rocks, so I just kind of shifted it to be able to make the temporary mana into permanent mana using a lot of
Mhm.
colorless. They then turned into colored mana. So it's kind of this huge shift from the play pattern to just I'm looking for a fast hand that's able to do what every other deck in the format is doing. Play the land, ritual, rock, payoff turn one instead of just
Yep.
dork pass turn one. So all the mono green dorks got cut from the list in favor of mana rocks, and that's kind of the largest change that's happened very recently. I'd say 4 months ago. I mean, that's probably 3 months ago actually at this point.
That's
Uh,
surprising that it's taken us that long to get to this position with the deck. Like, I understand back in like the earlier versions of this deck, Teamer didn't have access to all of the talismans. It only had Talisman of Impulse, which is the red green one. It wasn't until Modern Horizons came around that we got Talisman of Curiosity, the Simic one, and Talisman of Creativity, the Is It one. Arcane Signet wasn't a card back then, so you really didn't have that critical mass of 2 mana rocks that produced the colors of mana that you needed to fill out the deck and make that a viable strategy for developing your mana base.
Right, and I can't really use that the rocks weren't out as an excuse because they were out since I started playing the game. But I think what happened is, I mean, there's just not a lot of brewers for this specific kind of deck, right? Huge props out to Jack, right? He maintained
Mhm.
and has been like a Animar supporter for literally years since the deck's creation, basically. And he kind of took me on when I started writing a comprehensive primer for this deck, and we kind of just hit it off from there. And now we kind of brew and do everything together. But yeah, the primer that I've written that will be linked in the description is kind of a big point for this deck too, because there was nothing like it before it came out. People would come onto the Discord and then they would just get this slew of information from random people about how to play the deck without a central point of access, so to speak. So after I wrote this primer and did a lot of changes to the deck, it kind of became a lot more streamlined with what the deck's trying to do and with people coming on to learn about it.
Yeah, I love to see that an 11-year-old commander is sort of seeing this like new life to it with dedicated brewers like yourself and Jack that are really trying to push the archetype and to cut away sort of the sacred cows of past of like you have to run all of the creatures. We're trying to play Animar on turn two. And I think it's really rewarded and the deck is in a much better position than where it was a few
I,
months ago even.
I hear all the time, whether it's just jokes at me or not, that like Animar is a bad commander and there's better things to be doing, which maybe I don't disagree with you, but I kind of do. I mean, I don't ever feel like at this point in the deck that I just fall so behind all of my opponents that it's just ridiculous. But I did feel like that before all these changes, so I feel like we're doing something good with all these new changes to the deck. Yeah, we all open up the Discord all the time for brewing and answer people's questions, and it's really a great spot to just figure out how the deck works.
Cool. So I think birthing pod is another change that you had highlighted that you wanted to go over real quick.
So Birthing Pod I tried to make work in the deck before I did all the land and artifact changes because it's just such a powerful card that lets you turn your dorks and things like that into your dockside and much larger impact creatures. But it was hard to support before you had all this colorless mana to back it up. But now it's really easy to just go land Mana Vault, Birthing Pod, turn one, right? So that's another tutor that's just I've been wanting to run for a long time. It's super powerful for the evolution build, and the recent artifact ramp just kind of pushed it into the right spot into the deck.
Birthing pod is probably one of my favorite cards ever printed, so you don't need to
It
convince
is
me of another reason to play it.
it is by far the most countered card in my deck recently because if it just sits there and accumulates value for 1 or 2 turns, the game's over. You can't stop me at that point.
Again, it's one of those that's banned in an internal format. It's banned in modern. It's probably worth looking at in this format.
Definitely.
Cool. So, why don't we talk about some of the misconceptions that you commonly see in the deck? So, as someone
So
who has really changed the way that Animar has been played and built in recent months, how have you sort of shifted the look or the view of what Animar is? And like what are good cards in it, what are bad cards in it?
Yeah, so after I started helping run the Discord, I run into these questions all the time that are just common misconceptions about the deck, really. Um, by far, the biggest one that I run into is something will get spoiled from the new set. It's an 8 CMC creature with this crazy effect, but someone will come into the Discord saying, "Hey guys, have you seen this one yet?" And I look at it, and it's a really cool learning experience. Definitely a learning curve. Is that you can't just put big creatures into Animar and hope for the best, because it comes back to that same philosophy that if it's good without Animar, then it's definitely worth looking at. But if it's only good with Animar and it's getting cost reduced, then it's like maybe we should start looking at other things. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions, especially when spoiler season's out. I see that all the time.
Yeah, everyone
Um,
sees new shiny cards, they wanna play with them, they wanna look at the ceiling
oh,
of
and
the
I love
card and what it
them.
can
Yeah,
do. I know I harp
that's
on our other
great.
host, Greg, constantly for him looking at, like, the absolute ceiling of cards. I try and bring him back down of, like, what is the floor here? What are we normally doing with this?
Yeah, someone needs to bring him down sometimes.
I am
Uh,
happy to take up the role.
oh, thank you. We appreciate it. Uh, Another big misconception I see is that plus one synergies are good for the deck. So you really just are trying to put yourself in combo range and value range with Animar, which is normally one counter or two counters on him to really get some value going or your win going. So what recently changed too is Mere Scrappling and Bond Beetle. They are just creatures that give a plus one counter when they enter the battlefield,
Oh, I
essentially.
remember these guys.
Yeah, they were very recent changes, and they don't do anything else besides give that counter. So there's exactly one turn in the game that they're really good for accelerating Animar, but then they do nothing, right? They sit on the
It's
battlefield and then they don't provide any extra value. So I've kind of shifted off of them and shifted to just running good cards and good creatures that you can just cast while Animar's out and just let that value build up on its own while you're already doing good things.
what an incredibly novel take. Just play good cards in the good
Just play
format.
good cards.
Don't play bad
100%.
cards to make them better, or don't play bad cards along bad cards to make them good. Just play good cards to start.
Oh, 100%.
I think
Mugger's a
that's
good card.
a common brewer's pitfall is wanting to play these bad cards with cute synergies and interactions in the hope that they're good, but
Oh,
oftentimes you're
no.
just gonna draw a Bond Beetle and wonder why I sleeved this card up in the
Oh,
first
top
place.
decking a Bond Beetle after your board wipe is like, where's my counter spell? Where's my rebuild piece? Where's my Mezio Mugger? All these other things.
I think another card I had seen in the deck that kind of fits the similar theme of plus one synergies was Hardened Scales was definitely in my more casual list.
So every casual version of Animar runs a similar suite of cards, one of them being Hardened Scales because it's ridiculous value to Animar. But since we're able to just run these like low to the ground good creatures that are already low CMC because it's cEDH. There's no reason to run these accelerators for Animar. Like Animar doesn't need the extra help. So the scenario here is that he lands, right? And then you cast a creature, get a counter, cast another creature, get another counter, and now you're within really good value and combo range. But you could cast Animar, cast Hardened Scales, and then cast another creature to put two counters on Animar. But you've cast two spells since Animar, right? So why not just run a better card than Hardened Scales, one that will give you value before your Animar's out in the first place? You know
Yeah,
what I
this
mean? Like,
definitely fits along the line of some of the other cards that I've used to see Animar run, where you had things like Cloud of Fairies or Pelican, or what is it? The 5/5 Drake that untaps 5 lands when it enters play, or
oh
Palinkron,
yeah,
Pester
Peregrine
Might,
Drake.
yeah, Peregrine Drake, Deceiver Exarch. These sort of creatures that basically you can play for free and increase that Animar counter. And they were played alongside Glimpse of Nature. This was one of the decks that used to run Glimpse of Nature alongside 45 creatures. Now that you've cut it down to 29, you've cut down these sort of like free creature cards. You're not really like this crazy spell slinger, I'm going to play 45 creatures in a turn type of deck. You're just trying to get your Adamar to 2 counters, 3 counters maybe, and then just find that one card that lets you win.
Oh, 100%. There's no reason to run these rituals for Animar anymore because you have Dockside. And if you already use your Dockside, you have a copy of Dockside. And if you already use that copy of Dockside, you have another copy of Dockside.
In worst case
So you're
scenario, you run an option to pick up those copies and replay your dock sides again.
I've been experimenting with Alchemist Retrieval and Snap. I'm pretty high on Snap recently. But any you can just use Dockside as your constant ritual throughout the game. So there's not really a reason to run all of these untaps like Cloud of Fairies and Paragon Drake anymore. You can kind of just play the good ritual, put out really good value cards, Sphinx, Rhystic Study, Archaic, anything that'll just get you that ridiculous value. And that's your kind of what you're looking to do. You're not really looking to storm anymore in the current version of the deck.
All right, you've heard it here first. Dockside, good card.
Oh, ridiculous card, in my opinion.
Cool. So I think we're almost running out of time here. So why don't we hop into our community question, which I think you picked up a good one here.
Yeah, so our community question for this episode is what cards for Animar specifically looked good at face value, but after testing proved not worthwhile? So I've done a lot of testing, right? There was a point where there was like pages in my binder of just cards that just didn't work out for Animar. And the one I'm most disappointed in not working out is the future side effects, right? The cards that let you look at the top card of your library and play it if it's a creature. um, Such as Augur of Autumn or Vizier of the Menagerie. And what happened is, as I cut down the creature count of the deck, I ended up top decking like two spells in a row, like a counter spell and then a land, or a land and a counter spell type thing. Instead of the double creature, I need to just kind of keep the value rolling. So they ended up just not being worthwhile because I kept bricking the top card of my library, and they ended up getting cut for things that can just draw me, like blanket draw me a couple cards, like Mezio Mugger, for example, which is just better than trying to cast it off the top of my deck.
I know Augur of Autumn keeps the top card hidden, but is Vizier one that also flips the top card and
Vizier
reveals it?
keeps it hidden, but you can use
Okay.
mana or a mana of any color. But Augur of Autumn has this clause where you have to have three creatures of different powers on the battlefield to be able to cast the creatures. But you can also
Okay.
hit your land drop off Augur. So it's like situational, but it's too situational for me in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we're at the point in the format where we have such a high density of value pieces that it's a really high bar to make it in a deck like this. Augur of Autumn, it's just not going to draw you or give you the same number of cards as something like the Mizio Mugger that gives you immediate value. The Grazilax that is just going to draw card after card after card, turn after turn after turn, and also synergizes with the deck and what you're already doing. And then obviously you have format stalwarts like Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora that are just never. I pray that they never get dethroned because if they are, boy, do we have some powerful cards that are being
Oh
printed at
yeah.
that point.
Uh, what I will say though is on the flip side of this question is cards that I've tested that have been proved to be really good that I kind of were iffy on. I'm just gonna say Time Twister. I think it might be a little controversial and a hot take for Animar to be on Time Twister, but it's shuffle the graveyards away, draw seven cards, and if you the wheels are hard to play in cEDH, but I've had this experience where I can just play a couple dock sides, make 13 treasures, and then wheel, and then capitalize on the wheel first, and maybe even win the game off that, which is just absolutely ridiculous. So I think Time Twister has been my surprisingly awesome card
In
in
Time
recent
Twister
time.
specifically, I know some decks, like I remember the four color evolution decks that were very centered on Underworld Breach, ultimately cut it because they wanted to have constant access to that graveyard, and every card that you were putting into the graveyard was advancing your gameplay. So I see even decks like Blue Farm that are running Time Twister, they'd much rather be casting a Wheel of Fortune or a Windfall to keep fueling that graveyard that acts as a second hand. So Time
Mhm.
Twister also not only just filling your hand and kind of resetting everyone back to parity, but also completely wiping out the graveyards that your deck doesn't really get to utilize, but the other decks certainly are missing it, is going to be a positive effect.
Yeah, without having the breach lines in the deck, Time Twister is kind of the only viable wheel, in my opinion, for the deck. But if you can time it right and time out the interaction of your opponents to play it in the correct manner, it's a really powerful card. 3 mana, draw seven is ridiculous, no matter what deck you're playing.
I can't argue with that.
So I think since we're ending the episode here. A couple of ending notes I'd just like to leave off on is join the Animar Discord, right? Come see what we're all about. We're always brewing and talking about all things Animar. There's fantastic resources. There's the primer, there's the database list, there's my personal list, there's um, the core list. The core list is a really interesting resource because it's kind of the core 90, 85 cards of Animar that you can kind of add a few choice picks based off that core list. Jack and I are always answering questions on there. Yeah, and it's just a really awesome place to just learn and play competitive Animar.
Yeah, I definitely love seeing more Discord groups focused around a given deck or an archetype, being really positive forces in the community and really trying to drive innovation. Especially for something as old as Animar coming up on, it'll be 12 years old next year, which is wild.
12 years old. I've only been playing the deck a year, so I think we're in a good spot for 12 years.
Very nice.
Yeah, so we've been the Pass Priority Podcast. I'm Evan, and this was Zach, and we pass priority.
Thanks, guys.